We then move forward to what some people call the golden age of vampires. We're talking about the age of reason. So starting in the late 1600s, early 1700s, the Enlightenment, the period at which supposedly superstition is being cast out of the European civilization, and science and the arts and the classical values are all becoming central. And this, of course, is the famous Goya print, which the legend of the sleep of reason produces monsters. It's a nice illustration of two different ways of looking at why vampires start to rear their head at just the point you'd expect them to be extinct. Because you can interpret that two ways. One of them is that we need reason to combat monsters, to combat superstition. The other one, of course, is that actually reason in a perverse kind of way creates monsters. That if we live in our day-to-day lives, refusing to take any of this on board, when we sleep, they emerge anyway twice as strong. And you'll notice here that most of them are represented by these sort of monstrous owl things. And one of the creatures sometimes identified with the vampire, when people say, oh, the vampire goes back to classical mythology, are various creatures from Roman, blood-drinking creatures from Roman myth and folklore. But they're sort of bird spirits. They're clearly not corpses, and so they don't belong in our category. The interest in vampires builds steadily alongside developments in printing technology, increasing literacy, and so forth. By this time, our vampire plague has spread further eastward, and so we're reaching the fringes of European civilization at the time. So we're reaching places like Hungary, we're reaching places like Serbia, we're reaching places like Greece, and I suppose we're also reaching places like Transylvania, of course. The real explosion in interest in vampires occurs with a couple of cases in, my memory serves me right, Hungary, and I think the other one is in Serbia. And a chap called Arnold Paul, another chap called Peter Plogowitz, were 1725 and 1726. Classic cases whereby, again, plague, what we're going to do. Okay, we've got these two ne'er-do-wells, Arnold and Peter. These guys are dug up, and again, corpses look suspiciously healthy, bloated, red, stink, blood around the mouth. What makes these cases slightly different, and I think helped capture people's imaginations, was that these were investigated by official envoys that included lawyers, soldiers, so basically all the kind of people who could give some kind of veracity to a story like this. And they basically insisted that what the locals were saying seemed to be right. And there are also cases and accounts, people sending letters back saying they'd actually seen these corpses being dug up, some of them sat up. There was some pioneering work done some time ago. Author Paul Barber wrote a book called Vampires, Death and Burial, where he actually applies a sort of forensic eye to these stories and basically gives a lot of highly plausible reasons why corpses might be preserved better, why they might sit up, why the hair and the nails might appear to grow, why there was blood around the mouth. So, I mean, we don't necessarily require a supernatural explanation for why this is going on, but clearly this is what people thought. There's another interesting religious explanation for why this became important, and that's that most of the areas we're talking about now where vampires are cropping up are Eastern Orthodox, so Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, while the authorities that are emerging, and primarily the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is Catholic. Now, there's a very, what seems like a trivial but significant difference in doctrine here, which is illuminating for the vampires we're looking at. And that's the idea about what happens to a corpse after you die and what the significance of that is. In Eastern Orthodox theology, a crucial part of passing on to the other side, moving into heaven, is decomposition. So somebody decomposing is somebody sort of their spirit moving on to the delights of paradise. If somebody doesn't decompose, then obviously that implies they're not moving on. So one suggestion is that this rises at a time when there's a lot of tension, because these areas had been under the rule of the Ottoman Turks for quite some time. And this was a new development for the Catholics to move in. And so you have two things. One is that the Catholic authorities are seeing these areas for the first time. The Ottoman Turks had a fairly laissez-faire attitude to the European territories they conquered and ruled. Basically, you can have your own local priests and your own crazy superstitions. We don't care as long as you pay your taxes. The Austro-Hungarians took a rather more hands-on approach. Anyway, these accounts created absolute sensations, discussed in the courts of France, influential journals dedicating whole issues to the vampire question, the various Enlightenment philosophers wringing their hands and decrying the spread of the vampire myth. The most significant, incidentally, this is when we're having the word vampire reaching us. As I understand it, the first time it ever appeared in an English document was in one of the magazines covering the cases I was describing, which was printed in 1732. The real sort of the bestseller, the blockbuster of this, the Golden Age of Vampires, was written by a French priest called Dom Calmet. And in it, interestingly enough, it came out 1746. And interestingly enough, Calmet was a skeptic. He regarded the idea of these corpses coming back because they hadn't decomposed as being nonsense. And he, in particular, spent some time saying, well, how do these guys get out of the coffin? Which is a very good point. I mean, you'll notice with two exceptions, I mean, there's a nice scene in Brides of Dracula, but in most cases they decide it's better to keep the vampires in vaults. Otherwise you have lengthy scenes of them trying to escape the coffin and burrow their way up. And Calmet sort of says, well, you see these corpses cavorting about. Okay, how do they get out of there and how do they get back in with nobody noticing? But despite Calmet taking a very sceptical view, it's actually his book which spreads the idea most significantly. Okay, so we've had the Age of Reason. The vampire as a living entity, at least in the West, starts to die off in the 1800s. And he moves from being a figure in travelogues and theological debates into being a character in Gothic fiction. The most significant development here is probably a book. There are various poems and bits and pieces appear. Byron, the mad, bad and dangerous to know romantic poet, mentions a vampire in one of his poems. There's a later, Lake Geneva, there's the famous ghost story competition, which again is probably, so it's where Frankenstein comes from. It's also where Byron composes a vampire fragment, which he never finishes, and between you and me is fairly crappy. But we don't know who won the ghost story competition. In terms of immortality, it was Frankenstein. One of the people at this particular wild party in Geneva was Byron's physician, a chap called Dr. Polidori. And he took Byron's fragment away and turned it into a novella, which became a huge success, partially because everyone thought Byron had written it, which was very frustrating for both Byron and Polidori, not least because many critics said it was the best thing Byron had ever written. The significant part here is the lead character is clearly a fictionalized version of Byron himself, a figure called Lord Riven. And Lord Riven is clearly the prototype for our modern vampire. He's an aristocrat. He's a literal lady killer. He doesn't smell. He doesn't resemble a drum. I don't think he actually ever goes into a coffin, but he's clearly the first of a new breed of vampires. Once you get towards this new breed of vampires, you have the supernatural powers, the immortality, you're irresistible to the opposite sex or the same sex if you happen to be in an Anne Rice novel. And more than one commentator has said you look at this and you have to figure, what's the catch? Why wouldn't everybody want to be a vampire? Well, this may give us something of a clue. This is a piece of work by my favourite artist, a Belgian decadent called Félicien Rops. What he's showing us here is basically a rather fetching parable on prostitution. Now, if you want to understand why people found and perhaps still should find vampires scary, I might draw your attention to an urban legend that always used to do the rounds, certainly in the 80s. I don't know, it might still do the rounds. Most busy pubs you went to would have somebody who would tell you a story whereby they would tell you that someone frequented the pub and liked to pick people up and was very cute, but also had AIDS. And because they'd been given AIDS, they decided to pass it around. And this clearly is sort of quite a chilling urban legend. You see things in the papers where occasionally something resembling this happens, but it's something that travels more as an urban legend than anything. And the guy who tells this story is probably just looking for attention. But basically, vampirism is still about plague, but it has mutated. Whether it's literally mutated or whether it's mutated in some occult or figurative fashion is another matter. But it has mutated. Now, one of the real plagues of the Victorian era was syphilis. Now, there's a theory, and it's been highly contested, but there's a theory that says that Bram Stoker had syphilis, and that's what killed him, and that's what created the slightly peculiar attitude to sexuality that you find in Dracula. You don't really need that in order to sort of come up with this theory, because whether people are conscious of it or not, then syphilis created this link between pleasure and extinction, sex and death, which operated, on the subconsciousness of the entire generation. And it's a particularly pernicious and unpleasant way to go. Not only will you get various sort of disfigurement, bits of you falling off, you go crazy. So, it's clearly a very high price to pay for a good time, which is what Félicien Rops is suggesting here. So in a way, the vampire being a creature that links pleasure with death has mutated to give us this kind of figure